In the heart of the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where golden spires pierce the morning mist and centuries-old secrets sleep beneath marble floors, the impossible happened on a Tuesday that would rewrite history. King Edmund Aldrich, beloved ruler of 43 years, vanished from his locked chambers without a trace, leaving behind only a cold cup of tea and a kingdom trembling on the edge of chaos. But what the palace guards discovered in those empty rooms would spark the most dangerous game of power the realm had ever witnessed. Because sometimes, the greatest threats to a crown come not from enemy armies, but from those who sleep closest to the throne. The morning bells of Valdoria would ring differently forever after, and Queen Isabella's first command as regent would send shockwaves through every noble house in the land. This is the story of a disappearance that became a revolution, a mystery that became a reckoning, and a queen who discovered that seizing power is far easier than keeping it when the very foundations of your world begin to crumble beneath your feet. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Thornwick Palace when Margaret Hawthorne, head chambermaid for 37 years, knocked 3 times on the heavy oak doors of the royal chambers. The sound echoed through the silence like a funeral drum. When no response came, she knocked again, her weathered knuckles barely making a whisper against the ancient wood. "Your Majesty?" Margaret called softly, pressing her ear to the door. "Your morning tea, sire." Still nothing. Margaret's heart began its familiar dance of anxiety. In all her years of service, King Edmund had never failed to respond to the morning call. He was a creature of habit, rising at dawn to review state documents before the castle stirred to life. She had served him his Earl Grey tea at precisely 7:15 every morning since his coronation, and he had always been dressed and waiting, often already buried in correspondence or military reports. She tried the heavy brass handle. Locked as always. Palace protocol dictated that the king's chambers remain secured from within during the night hours. Only King Edmund himself could unlock the doors from inside, or the master of keys could open them from without in cases of emergency. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she set the silver tea service on the marble side table. Something felt wrong. The very air seemed to hum with an unnatural tension, as if the ancient stones themselves were holding their breath. She hurried down the corridor, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floor. The palace was beginning to wake around her. Footmen moved like shadows through the halls, lighting candles and opening heavy curtains to let the dawn filter through stained glass windows. Kitchen staff bustled in the distance, preparing the morning meal. Yet everything felt muffled, distant, as though she were moving through a dream. Margaret found Sir Thomas Blackwood, the master of keys, in his small office near the main entrance. He was a thin, precise man with silver hair and eyes like winter frost. He had served the crown for over 20 years and took his responsibilities with the gravity of a priest. "Sir Thomas," Margaret began, trying to keep her voice steady. "The king, he's not responding to the morning call." Blackwood looked up from his ledger, his quill suspended in midair. "Not responding? I've knocked several times." Called out. "Nothing, sir. The doors are locked from within, as usual, but—" Margaret wrung her hands. Something isn't right. Blackwood set down his quill with deliberate care. He had learned, in his years of service, to trust the instincts of the palace staff. Margaret Hawthorne was not given to flights of fancy or unnecessary dramatics. If she felt something was amiss, it likely was. "Very well," he said, rising from his chair. "Let us check on His Majesty." They walked together through the awakening palace, past tapestries that told the story of Valdoria's triumphs and defeats, past portraits of long-dead kings and queens whose painted eyes seemed to follow their movement. The morning light streaming through the tall windows created patterns on the floor that shifted and danced as clouds moved across the sun. When they reached the royal chambers, Blackwood knocked firmly on the doors. His knock had authority, the sound of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Your Majesty? Thomas Blackwood here. Are you well, sire?" The silence stretched between them like a taut string. Margaret found herself counting heartbeats, each one louder than the last. Blackwood produced his master key, a heavy iron piece worn smooth by decades of use. Palace protocol required the presence of 2 witnesses before entering the king's private chambers uninvited. Margaret would serve as one. He sent a passing footman to fetch Captain Reynolds of the Palace Guard. Captain James Reynolds arrived within minutes, his military bearing evident in every step. He was a broad-shouldered man with graying temples and scars that spoke of battles fought in service to the crown. His hand rested naturally on the pommel of his sword, a habit developed over 20 years of protecting the royal family. "What's the situation?" Reynolds asked, his voice low and controlled. "His Majesty is not responding to the morning call," Blackwood explained. "We need to ensure his safety." Reynolds nodded grimly. In a world where assassination attempts and political intrigue were constant threats, any deviation from normal routine had to be taken seriously. Blackwood turned the key. The lock clicked with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet corridor. He pushed open the heavy doors, and all three stepped inside. The royal chambers were exactly as they should be, yet completely wrong. The sitting room was immaculate. Books lay open on side tables where the king had been reading the night before. A chess set sat half-finished, the pieces frozen in an eternal game. The fire in the hearth had burned down to cold ashes, suggesting it had not been tended since the evening before. But King Edmund was nowhere to be seen. "Your Majesty?" Captain Reynolds called, his hand now firmly gripping his sword hilt. They moved through the sitting room toward the bedchamber beyond. The bedroom told the same strange story. The massive four-poster bed was empty, its covers thrown back as if someone had risen in haste. The king's nightclothes lay crumpled on the floor beside the bed. His day clothes remained hanging in the wardrobe, untouched. Most peculiar of all was the tea service on the bedside table. A delicate porcelain cup sat half-empty, the Earl Grey within stone cold. Beside it lay an uneaten biscuit and an opened letter bearing the royal seal. "The balcony," Reynolds muttered, striding toward the tall glass doors that led to the king's private balcony overlooking the palace gardens. The doors were closed but unlocked. Reynolds pushed them open and stepped outside, the others following. The balcony commanded a spectacular view of Valdoria's capital city, with its winding river and red-tiled roofs stretching to the horizon. But there was no sign of the king. Could he have fallen? Margaret whispered, peering over the stone railing. Below lay the palace gardens, with their carefully manicured hedges and flower beds. No broken bushes, no disturbed earth, no sign of any impact. "Not possible," Reynolds said grimly. "The railing is too high, and the king was in excellent health." They searched every corner of the chambers. The private study, the dressing room, even the small prayer alcove where the king sometimes went for meditation. Nothing. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, no indication of where King Edmund might have gone. Blackwood examined the letter on the bedside table. The royal seal was unbroken, the message within seemingly routine correspondence about trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms. Nothing urgent, nothing that would cause a man to abandon his chambers in the middle of the night. "We need to alert Queen Isabella immediately," Captain Reynolds said. His voice carried the weight of a man who understood the gravity of the situation. "And seal these chambers. No one else enters until we determine what happened here." But, as they prepared to leave, Margaret noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the marble floor beside the king's writing desk lay a single black rose petal. She had been cleaning these chambers for decades and had never seen anything like it. The king kept no black roses, and such flowers did not grow in the palace gardens. She picked up the petal carefully, its surface soft as velvet, but somehow menacing. Black roses were the symbol of House Ravencrest, the ancient noble family that had been exiled from Valdoria nearly 50 years ago for plotting against the crown. "Sir Thomas," she whispered, holding up the petal. Blackwood's face went white as winter snow. Captain Reynolds cursed under his breath. The implications were staggering. If House Ravencrest was somehow involved in the king's disappearance, it meant that old enemies had found a way to penetrate the very heart of the kingdom. It meant that the exile had not ended their ambitions, merely forced them to become more patient, more cunning. As they sealed the royal chambers and hurried through the corridors toward Queen Isabella's quarters, none of them could shake the feeling that they were walking into the opening moves of a game that had been planned for decades. The disappearance of King Edmund was not a random event or a simple crime of opportunity. It was the first strike in a war that would determine the future of Valdoria itself. The palace bells began to ring as words spread through the corridors like wildfire. Servants whispered in corners. Guards took positions with grim determination. The machinery of the royal court ground into motion, but, without its central figure, everything felt uncertain, unstable. Queen Isabella received the news in her private sitting room, where she had been reviewing the day's social calendar over breakfast. She was a woman of 45 years, with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that missed nothing. She had been born to nobility but had earned her position as queen through both political acumen and genuine love for her husband. When Captain Reynolds delivered his report, The queen's composure never wavered, though her knuckles went white as she gripped her teacup. "You're certain he's not anywhere in the palace?" she asked, her voice steady as granite. "We've initiated a complete search, Your Majesty," Reynolds replied. "Every room, every passage, every possible location. No sign of His Majesty anywhere." Isabella set down her teacup with infinite care. Her mind was already racing through possibilities, threats, implications. She had been queen long enough to understand that this moment would define not just her reign, but the very survival of the kingdom. "The black rose petal," she said quietly. "You're certain it was from House Ravencrest?" "Their symbol, Your Majesty," Blackwood confirmed. "Unmistakable." Isabella rose from her chair, and, in that movement, something fundamental shifted in the room. The queen was gone, replaced by a ruler facing the greatest crisis of her life. "Very well," she said, her voice carrying new authority. "Captain Reynolds, double the guard immediately. Seal all entrances to the palace. No one enters or leaves without my personal authorization. Sir Thomas, I want a complete inventory of anyone who has accessed the royal chambers in the past month. Margaret, you will speak to no one about what you've seen until I give you permission." She moved to the window, looking out over her kingdom with eyes that had seen too much and understood even more. "And, Captain," she added without turning around, "send word to the noble council. We convene in 1 hour. It's time they learn that their king has vanished, and that House Ravencrest may have returned to settle old scores." The game had begun, and Queen Isabella intended to play it better than anyone expected. But, as she watched the sun climb higher over Valdoria, she couldn't shake the feeling that her husband's disappearance was just the opening move in something much larger and far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The kingdom was about to learn what happened when wolves returned to hunt in familiar territory, and the crown itself hung in the balance. The noble council chamber had seen many crises in its 300-year history, but none quite like this. The circular room, with its vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of Valdorian victories, felt smaller somehow as 12 of the kingdom's most powerful nobles gathered around the ancient oak table that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. Queen Isabella entered precisely 1 hour after summoning them, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor with the rhythm of controlled authority. She had changed from her mourning dress into deep blue velvet, the royal color that announced her intentions before she spoke a word. The crown of Valdoria rested on her auburn hair, not the delicate circlet she usually wore for formal occasions, but the heavy ceremonial crown reserved for matters of state. The nobles rose as she entered, their faces reflecting various degrees of confusion, concern, and, in some cases, poorly concealed ambition. These were not mere courtiers playing at politics. Each man and woman around this table commanded vast estates, controlled trade routes, or held military positions that could make or break the kingdom. Lord Aldrich Westmere, the eldest among them at 72, had silver hair and eyes like winter steel. He controlled the northern provinces and their lucrative mining operations. Lady Catherine Fairfax, sharp as a blade at 55, managed the kingdom's extensive spy networks and foreign intelligence. Duke Marcus Thornfield commanded the southern armies that protected Valdoria's borders. Each face told a story of power carefully cultivated over decades. "Be seated," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "We have urgent matters to discuss." She remained standing as they settled into their high-backed chairs, the ancient wood creaking with the weight of history. The morning sunlight streaming through stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns on the table, but the beauty of the scene felt somehow ominous given the circumstances. "Gentlemen, ladies," Isabella began, "I must inform you that King Edmund is missing." The silence that followed was deafening. Several nobles leaned forward, as if they hadn't heard correctly. Lady Fairfax's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. "Missing, Your Majesty?" Lord Westmere asked, his voice careful and controlled. "Could you elaborate?" Isabella placed her hands flat on the table, leaning slightly forward. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. She was taking command, not requesting permission. "The king disappeared from his locked chambers sometime during the night. There are no signs of struggle, no indication of how he departed, and no obvious explanation for his absence. A thorough search of the palace has revealed nothing." Duke Thornfield shifted in his chair, his military bearing evident, even seated. "Your Majesty, with respect, people don't simply vanish from locked rooms. There must be a rational explanation. Perhaps His Majesty rose early for a private walk, or The king's nightclothes were found on the floor, Isabella interrupted. His day clothes remain untouched in the wardrobe. His morning tea sits cold and unfinished in his chambers. Edmund has maintained the same routine for over 20 years. He does not simply go for walks without informing his security detail. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Each noble understood that the king's disappearance wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a potential catastrophe for the kingdom's stability. Furthermore, Isabella continued, we found evidence that suggests this disappearance may not be random. She nodded to Captain Reynolds, who had been standing at attention near the door. He stepped forward and placed a small velvet pouch on the table. From it, he withdrew the black rose petal Margaret had discovered. The reaction was immediate and telling. Lady Fairfax went pale. Lord Westmere cursed under his breath. Several younger nobles looked confused, but the older members of the council recognized the symbol immediately. House Ravencrest, Duke Thornfield said grimly. But that's impossible. They were exiled 50 years ago. Their estates were seized, their titles stripped, their family scattered. Exiled, yes, Isabella said quietly, but clearly not destroyed. The name Ravencrest carried weight in this room. The older nobles remembered the attempted coup that had nearly brought down Isabella's husband's father. Lord Victor Ravencrest had been King Edmund's uncle, the younger brother of the previous king. When his brother died and left the throne to his young son Edmund, Victor had believed the crown should pass to him as the more experienced heir. The civil war that followed had lasted 3 years and nearly torn the kingdom apart. Villages had burned, armies had clashed across the fertile valleys of Valdoria, and noble houses had chosen sides that determined their fates for generations. In the end, young King Edmund had prevailed, but the cost had been enormous. Victor Ravencrest and his family had been given a choice: execution for treason or permanent exile beyond the kingdom's borders. They had chosen exile, disappearing into the neighboring kingdoms with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a burning desire for revenge. We believe them broken, Lord Westmere said slowly. Their fortunes seized, their supporters dead or pardoned, and watching carefully. After 50 years of silence. 50 years to plan, Lady Fairfax corrected, her intelligence network having taught her the patience of those who plot in shadows. 50 years to gather resources, recruit allies, and plan their return. Isabella straightened, her crown catching the light from the stained glass windows. Which brings us to the immediate crisis. The kingdom cannot function without its king. Trade agreements need approval, military decisions require royal authorization, and our neighbors will soon learn of Edmund's absence. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the council. Until King Edmund is found, alive or dead, I am assuming the role of regent with full royal authority. The chamber erupted. Your Majesty, that's highly irregular, protested Lord Westmere. The succession laws are clear. In the absence of the king, the crown prince is 14 years old. Isabella cut him off sharply. Prince Alexander is brilliant and will make an excellent king in time, but he is not prepared to lead a kingdom that may be under attack by exiled enemies seeking revenge. Duke Thornfield leaned back in his chair, his strategic mind already working through possibilities. The other kingdoms will see this as weakness. If word spreads that our king has simply vanished, then we control that word, Isabella said with quiet authority. For now, the official story is that King Edmund is ill and has temporarily delegated authority to me while he recovers. We buy time to investigate, to find him, and to prepare for whatever House Ravencrest has planned. Lady Fairfax nodded slowly. My intelligence networks can begin investigating immediately. If Ravencrest agents have returned to Valdoria, they will have left traces. Do it, Isabella commanded. I also want increased security around Prince Alexander and Princess Elena. If this is indeed a Ravencrest plot, they may target the royal children. And the military? Duke Thornfield asked. Full alert, but quietly. I don't want panic in the streets or neighboring kingdoms sensing weakness. Double the palace guard, increase patrols along our borders, and recall the 3rd Regiment from the Northern Territories. As the nobles discussed logistics and security measures, Isabella found herself studying their faces carefully. House Ravencrest had originally gained power through political alliances and carefully placed supporters. If they had returned after 50 years, they wouldn't have done so without inside help. Someone at this very table might already be working with the exiled house. The thought chilled her more than the morning air. The people she was trusting to help find her husband and protect her children might include the very traitors who had made his disappearance possible. Lord Westmere, she said suddenly, I want a complete review of all financial records from your northern provinces for the past year. Any unusual expenditures, any new trade partnerships, any irregular activity whatsoever. The old lord's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or fear. Your Majesty surely doesn't suspect. I suspect everyone until my husband is found safe, Isabella replied coldly. Lady Fairfax, the same review applies to your intelligence operations. Duke Thornfield, your military logistics, and supply chains. Every noble house will submit to complete financial and operational audits. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. These were proud people accustomed to managing their affairs without royal interference. But Isabella's tone brooked no argument. We are facing a threat that has had 50 years to prepare, she continued. They know our weaknesses, our routines, our people. The only way to counter such long-term planning is with complete transparency and absolute loyalty. She looked around the table, meeting each set of eyes directly. If anyone in this room has any information about potential Ravencrest agents, any suspicious activity in their territories, or any knowledge whatsoever that might relate to the king's disappearance, you will share it now or face charges of treason. The silence stretched like a blade edge. Isabella counted heartbeats, watching faces, reading micro-expressions that might reveal guilt or fear. It was Lady Fairfax who finally spoke, her voice thoughtful and measured. Your Majesty, there has been one irregularity in my intelligence reports. 3 months ago, several of my agents reported unusual activity in the port city of Greyrock. Strangers asking questions about palace routines, servant schedules, guard rotations. At the time, it seemed like minor criminal reconnaissance, perhaps thieves planning a heist. And you didn't report this? Duke Thornfield asked sharply. We investigated and found nothing concrete. The strangers disappeared before we could identify them. It seemed insignificant. Isabella felt ice forming in her stomach. Greyrock was only a day's ride from the capital. If Ravencrest agents had been gathering intelligence about palace operations for months. Captain Reynolds, she called. Yes, Your Majesty. Send a full company to Greyrock immediately. I want every inn, every tavern, every boarding house searched. Find me witnesses who can describe these strangers. As the meeting continued, plans taking shape for investigation and defense, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that they were already several moves behind in a game that had been starting long before any of them realized they were playing. Somewhere out there, King Edmund was either a prisoner or worse. House Ravencrest had returned from exile with a plan 50 years in the making. And Isabella was beginning to understand that her husband's disappearance was not the end of their scheme, it was just the beginning. The real question was whether she could outmaneuver enemies who had spent half a century preparing for this moment, or whether the crown of Valdoria was about to change hands in the most devastating way possible. Outside the council chamber windows, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the wind carried whispers of change that would reshape the kingdom forever. 3 days had passed since King Edmund's disappearance, and the palace felt like a fortress under siege. Guards patrolled corridors with grim efficiency, servants whispered in corners, and every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Queen Isabella had barely slept, spending her hours poring over intelligence reports, financial records, and historical documents about House Ravencrest. The official story, that the king was suffering from a mild illness, was holding for now, but cracks were beginning to show. Foreign ambassadors were asking pointed questions. Trade merchants wondered why the king hadn't appeared for his usual weekly market inspections. Most concerning of all, Prince Alexander had begun asking why his father's chambers remained sealed and why so many additional guards surrounded the family quarters. Isabella stood in her private study, reviewing the latest reports from Greyrock, when Lady Fairfax arrived with news that would change everything. Your Majesty, Lady Fairfax said, her usual composure slightly strained. We found something significant. Isabella looked up from the documents spread across her mahogany desk. Maps of the kingdom, genealogies of noble houses, and coded intelligence reports created a mosaic of conspiracy that was slowly revealing its pattern. Tell me. My agents in Greyrock located the innkeeper who hosted the suspicious strangers 3 months ago. Under questioning, he revealed details that confirm our worst fears. Lady Fairfax placed a leather portfolio on the desk and opened it to reveal sketches and written descriptions. 3 men and 1 woman, all well-dressed, all paying in foreign gold. They asked detailed questions about the palace, guard schedules, servant routines, the king's daily habits. They were particularly interested in the layout of the royal chambers and the locations of secret passages. Isabella's blood went cold. Secret passages? The old tunnels beneath the palace. They were built centuries ago as escape routes during wartime. Most people believe they were sealed decades ago, but House Ravencrest would have known about them. Isabella finished grimly. Victor Ravencrest grew up in this palace. He would have known every hidden corridor, every forgotten entrance. Lady Fairfax nodded. The innkeeper also provided detailed descriptions. One of the men matched historical records of Victor Ravencrest himself, though he would be over 80 now. But the woman, Lady Fairfax paused, consulting her notes. Dark hair, green eyes, aristocratic bearing, approximately 30 years old. She seemed to be leading the group. His daughter, Isabella said quietly. Or granddaughter. The next generation, raised on stories of exile and revenge. The implications were staggering. If House Ravencrest had indeed returned, they weren't just operating with the knowledge of the old generation. They had trained young successors who combined intimate knowledge of the palace with the energy and ambition of youth. There's more, Lady Fairfax continued. Captain Reynolds's investigation at the palace has uncovered evidence of the secret passages being recently used. Fresh scratches on stone walls, disturbed dust patterns, even a few drops of candle wax that couldn't be more than a week old. Isabella moved to the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. In the distance, she could see workers tending the roses that had been planted during her wedding to Edmund 25 years ago. Everything looked peaceful, normal, but she now knew that enemies had been moving beneath their feet like serpents in the darkness. They took him through the tunnels, she said, more to herself than to Lady Fairfax. That's how they got him out without anyone seeing. But where would they take him? Before Lady Fairfax could respond, urgent knocking echoed through the chamber. Captain Reynolds entered without waiting for permission, his face grave. Your Majesty, we have a situation. A messenger arrived at the gates under a flag of truce. He's requesting an immediate audience, and says he carries a message from King Edmund himself. Isabella's heart stopped. Bring him in. Under heavy guard. Within minutes, the study filled with palace guards as a man in traveling clothes was escorted inside. He was young, perhaps 25, with the lean build of someone accustomed to riding long distances. Most notably, he wore a black rose pinned to his coat, the symbol of House Ravencrest displayed boldly for all to see. Your Majesty, the messenger said, bowing formally but without subservience. His voice carried the educated accent of nobility. I bring word from your husband, King Edmund Aldrich. Speak, Isabella commanded, though her heart was racing. The messenger produced a sealed letter from his coat and held it up for all to see. The seal was unmistakably royal, the golden lion of Valdoria pressed into red wax. King Edmund is alive and unharmed, though he remains as our guest in a secure location. Lady Cassandra Ravencrest, rightful heir to the House of Ravencrest, extends her greetings to the Regent Queen and wishes to discuss terms for his safe return. Isabella felt the room spin slightly. Lady Cassandra Ravencrest, the woman from Greyrock, the granddaughter who had inherited 50 years of planning and revenge. What terms? Isabella asked, her voice deadly quiet. Lady Cassandra proposes a meeting. Tomorrow at sunset, at the ruins of Ravenshollow Castle. She will come with minimal escort, as should you. The king's life depends on this meeting taking place without military interference. Ravenshollow Castle, the ancestral seat of House Ravencrest, destroyed during the Civil War and left as a memorial to the cost of treason. It was a 2-hour ride from the palace, in the foothills where ancient oak trees grew thick enough to hide an army. And if I refuse? Isabella asked. The messenger's expression didn't change, but his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. Then, King Edmund will never be seen alive again, and Valdoria will learn what it means to have House Ravencrest return in force. Isabella studied the young man's face, reading the quiet confidence there. This wasn't a desperate gamble. This was a carefully orchestrated plan reaching its crucial phase. I'll need time to consider. No time. The messenger interrupted smoothly. Lady Cassandra has waited 50 years for this moment. She will not wait longer. Sunset tomorrow, Your Majesty. Come alone, or come not at all. He placed the sealed letter on the desk and stepped back. Oh, and Your Majesty? As a gesture of good faith, Lady Cassandra wanted me to give you this. From another pocket, he produced something that made Isabella's knees nearly buckle. It was Edmund's signet ring, the gold band carved with the royal lion that he had worn every day since his coronation. The king would never willingly remove that ring. It was as much a part of him as his right hand. Isabella forced herself to remain standing, to show no weakness before this messenger who was undoubtedly reporting every detail back to his mistress. "Tell Lady Cassandra that I will consider her proposal," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "Very good, Your Majesty. I will await your answer at the Thornwick Inn until midday tomorrow. After that, I return with or without your consent." The messenger bowed again and was escorted from the room under heavy guard. As soon as the doors closed behind him, Isabella sank into her chair, the full weight of the situation crashing down upon her. "It's a trap," Captain Reynolds said immediately. "They'll have archers hidden in those ruins, soldiers positioned throughout the forest. You can't possibly consider going." "Can't I?" Isabella asked quietly. She picked up Edmund's ring, turning the familiar weight over in her fingers. "If there's a chance to get him back." "Your Majesty," Lady Fairfax interjected, "we need to consider the larger implications. Even if they honor their word and release the king, what happens next? House Ravencrest doesn't want just to trade hostages. They want their revenge, their restoration." Isabella broke the seal on Edmund's letter with trembling fingers. The handwriting was unmistakably her husband's, though it seemed strained, written under duress. "My beloved Isabella," the letter read, "I am unharmed but held by those who claim old grievances against our house. They speak of justice, of wrongs that must be righted. The woman who leads them is intelligent and determined, driven by stories of injustice passed down through generations. I fear that simple negotiation will not resolve this crisis. They want more than my freedom. They want the crown itself. Trust Captain Reynolds, trust Lady Fairfax, but trust no one else completely. The plot runs deeper than we know, and I fear there are those within our own court who have aided this endeavor. Be careful, my love. The children must be protected above all else." Isabella read the letter twice before sharing its contents with the others. The confirmation of inside help was what she had feared most. Someone with access to the palace, someone trusted, had been feeding information to House Ravencrest for months or perhaps years. "We need to flush out the traitor," Lady Fairfax said grimly. "If there's someone in the palace working with them." "There's no time," Isabella replied. "They want an answer by midday tomorrow. That gives us less than 24 hours to decide whether to risk everything on this meeting." She stood and walked to the window again, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, Edmund was being held by people who had been raised on stories of betrayal and exile. Somewhere in her own palace, someone was preparing to help them complete their revenge. "Captain Reynolds," she said finally, "I want you to discreetly position troops in the forests around Raven's Hollow. Not close enough to be seen, but near enough to respond if needed." "You're not seriously considering going," Lady Fairfax said with alarm. "I'm considering all options," Isabella replied. "Lady Fairfax, I need you to accelerate your investigation into potential traitors. Check everyone who had access to the king's schedule, everyone who knew about the secret passages, everyone who could have provided the intelligence they needed." She turned back to face them, and they could see the transformation that had been building since Edmund's disappearance. The queen they had known, diplomatic, gracious, deferential to the noble council, was gone. In her place stood a ruler who had been forged in crisis and was ready to fight for her kingdom with whatever weapons she could find. "And I want complete background checks on every member of the noble council. Financial records, family connections, recent travel, everything. If House Ravencrest has supporters among our nobles, I will root them out before this is over." As evening fell over the palace, Isabella made her way to the sealed royal chambers. The guards admitted her silently, and she stood in the rooms where her husband had vanished just 3 days ago. Everything remained exactly as it had been found. The cold tea, the discarded nightclothes, the opened letter. She picked up the chess set where Edmund had been playing against himself, a habit he'd developed during times of political stress. The pieces were arranged in a complex endgame, with both kings under threat and victory hanging by the smallest of margins. How fitting, Isabella thought. Her husband had always been better at chess than she was, able to see dozens of moves ahead, to plan strategies that unfolded over months or years. But now she was the one who had to play the endgame, and the stakes couldn't be higher. She moved one of the white pieces, a queen protecting her king, and whispered a promise to the empty room. "I will bring you home, Edmund. Whatever it takes, whoever I have to outmaneuver, whatever prices I have to pay, I will bring you home." But even as she made the vow, Isabella knew that the game she was about to play would change her forever. Win or lose, the woman who emerged from this crisis would be someone entirely different from the one who had entered it. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the palace walls, Lady Cassandra Ravencrest was making her own preparations for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the kingdom for generations to come. The morning of the proposed meeting dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering like omens across the Valdorian sky. Isabella had spent the night in Edmund's study, surrounded by maps of the kingdom and reports from Lady Fairfax's investigators. She had made her decision, though it was one that would either save her husband or destroy them all. At precisely 9 o'clock, she summoned the noble council to an emergency session. The 12 most powerful people in the kingdom filed into the chamber with expressions ranging from concerned to calculating. Isabella noted that Lord Westmere seemed particularly nervous, constantly adjusting his ceremonial chain of office. "Ladies and gentlemen," Isabella began without preamble, "I have received communication from King Edmund's captors. They are demanding a face-to-face meeting today at sunset." The reaction was immediate and predictable. Voices rose in protest, concern, and strategic objection. Duke Thornfield was particularly vocal about the military impossibility of securing such a meeting. "Your Majesty, it's clearly a trap," he insisted. "No good can come from negotiating with traitors and kidnappers." "Nevertheless," Isabella said, raising her hand for silence, "I intend to go." The chamber erupted in chaos. Several nobles spoke at once, their voices creating a cacophony of objection and alarm. But Isabella was watching faces carefully, looking for tells, for signs of guilt or foreknowledge. Lady Catherine Fairfax seemed genuinely shocked. Duke Thornfield's objections had the ring of sincere military concern. But Lord Westmere's reaction seemed almost practiced, as if he had been preparing for this moment. "Furthermore," Isabella continued, her voice cutting through the protests, "I have discovered evidence of collaboration between House Ravencrest and someone within this palace. Someone with high-level access has been providing information to our enemies." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella could hear her own heartbeat as she studied each face around the table. "Lady Fairfax will now present her findings." Lady Fairfax stood, her intelligence reports crisp and damning. "Our investigation has revealed that the kidnappers possessed detailed knowledge that could only have come from inside sources. Guard schedules, the king's personal routines, the location of secret passages, even the combination to the royal treasury." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "We have also traced financial irregularities to several accounts connected to noble houses. Large sums moved through foreign banks, payments made to individuals with no legitimate business connections to Valdoria." Isabella watched Lord Westmere's face go ashen. His hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly. "The evidence points to a conspiracy that goes back months, possibly years," Lady Fairfax continued. "Someone at this table has been feeding information to House Ravencrest, enabling them to plan this operation in exquisite detail." "This is preposterous," Lord Westmere said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're accusing members of this council based on speculation and based on evidence," Isabella interrupted sharply. She nodded to Captain Reynolds, who stepped forward with a leather folder. "Lord Aldrich Westmere," Reynolds announced formally, "you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and collaboration with enemies of the crown." The old lord shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward. "This is outrageous. You demand nothing," Isabella said, her voice like winter steel. "Captain Reynolds, present the evidence." Reynolds opened the folder and began reading. "Financial transfers totaling 50,000 gold crowns to accounts controlled by known Ravencrest agents. Purchase of materials used to create the tunnels beneath the palace. Correspondence found hidden in your estate that details palace security measures and the king's personal schedule." As each piece of evidence was presented, Lord Westmere seemed to age before their eyes. The other nobles watched in horrified fascination as one of their own was revealed as a traitor. "Furthermore," Reynolds continued, "we have testimony from servants in your household who observed late-night meetings with strangers matching the descriptions of Ravencrest agents." Lord Westmere sank back into his chair, the fight going out of him like air from a punctured bladder. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "They didn't give me a choice." "There's always a choice," Isabella replied coldly. "Explain yourself." The old lord's voice was barely above a whisper. "My grandson. They took my grandson 18 months ago. Said they'd kill him if I didn't cooperate. He's only 12 years old, just a boy. The revelation shifted the atmosphere in the room. Several nobles looked uncomfortable, perhaps reconsidering their harsh judgment. A man protecting his family was understandable, even if his methods were treasonous. They knew everything about my household, my routine, my weaknesses, Westmere continued. Victor Ravencrest's granddaughter, Cassandra, she planned this for years. Every detail, every contingency. She said the Ravencrest family had been patient long enough. Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. What else did she plan? What happens after today's meeting? Westmere looked up at her with haunted eyes. She doesn't just want the king back. She wants the crown. She believes it's rightfully hers, that her grandfather was cheated out of his inheritance. The meeting today, it's not about negotiation. It's about forcing you to abdicate. And if I refuse? She has evidence. Documents that supposedly prove King Edmund's father was illegitimate, that the crown should have passed to Victor Ravencrest, and now to her. Whether the documents are real or forged doesn't matter. She has enough supporters to create a civil war if necessary. The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. This wasn't just about revenge for an old exile. This was about a systematic plan to reclaim what House Ravencrest believed was theirs by right. How many supporters? Duke Thornfield demanded. More than you think, Westmere admitted. Noble houses in the eastern provinces, merchant families who have been promised favorable trade agreements, even some military commanders who remember the old days. Isabella absorbed this information with growing dread. A civil war would tear the kingdom apart, exactly as it had 50 years ago. Thousands would die, cities would burn, and neighboring kingdoms might take advantage of the chaos to seize Valdorian territory. There's something else, Westmere said, his voice breaking. The meeting today, it's a trap, but not the kind you think. She doesn't plan to kill you. She plans to force you to witness something that will break your spirit completely. What do you mean? Tears were flowing down the old lord's weathered cheeks. She's going to execute King Edmund in front of you unless you publicly abdicate and recognize her claim to the throne. She wants you to choose between your husband's life and your kingdom. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Isabella felt the world spinning around her as the true cruelty of the plan became apparent. Cassandra Ravencrest wasn't just seeking political victory. She wanted personal devastation, forcing Isabella to make an impossible choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Guards, Isabella said quietly. Escort Lord Westmere to the dungeons. We'll decide his fate after this crisis is resolved. As the traitor was led away, Isabella turned to address the remaining council members. Their faces reflected the gravity of the situation. This was no longer just about finding a missing king. This was about the survival of the kingdom itself. Lady Fairfax, I need you to send immediate messages to all loyal noble houses. If House Ravencrest is planning a broader uprising, we need to know who stands with us. Already being done, Your Majesty, Lady Fairfax replied. Duke Thornfield, begin mobilizing our forces, but discreetly. I don't want to spark the very conflict we're trying to prevent. And the meeting? Duke Thornfield asked. Surely you cannot still be considering going. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ancient table where so many crucial decisions had been made over the centuries. She thought of Edmund, held captive by people driven by 50 years of hatred. She thought of her children, who might inherit a kingdom torn apart by civil war. She thought of the people of Valdoria, who deserved better than to become pawns in a game of royal revenge. I'm going, she said finally. But not as they expect. She turned to Lady Fairfax with new determination. How good are your disguise specialists? Lady Fairfax raised an eyebrow. The best in the kingdom, Your Majesty. What do you have in mind? If Cassandra Ravencrest wants to play games of deception, let's give her a game she won't forget. I need someone who can pass for me at a distance. Someone brave enough to ride into obvious danger. Your Majesty, Captain Reynolds protested. You cannot ask someone else to take such a risk. I'm not asking, Isabella interrupted. I'm commanding, and I'll be there too, just not where they expect me to be. She moved to the large map of the kingdom that covered one wall of the chamber. Ravenshollow Castle is built on a hill surrounded by forest. The ruins provide plenty of places to hide, and the old watchtower still offers commanding views of the surrounding area. Her finger traced paths through the forest around the ruined castle. Captain Reynolds, I want your best archers positioned here, here, and here. Lady Fairfax, your agents will approach from the eastern slope. Duke Thornfield, a full company of cavalry will be stationed in these woods, ready to respond at my signal. And you, Your Majesty? Lady Fairfax asked. Isabella smiled grimly. I'll be in the watchtower with a longbow, and a very personal interest in seeing my husband safely returned. As the council dispersed to make preparations, Isabella remained in the chamber with her thoughts. She understood now that she had been naive to think this crisis could be resolved through negotiation or political maneuvering. House Ravencrest had spent 50 years planning their revenge, and they intended to extract it in full. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They expected the diplomatic, gracious Queen Isabella, who had spent 25 years deferring to councils and following proper protocols. They had not prepared for the woman that crisis had forged, someone willing to fight for her kingdom with every weapon at her disposal. As afternoon shadows lengthened toward evening, Isabella made her final preparations. She donned dark clothing suitable for moving through forest undergrowth. She tested the longbow that had been her companion during hunting trips in happier times. She wrote letters to her children, to be delivered only if she didn't return. The game was entering its endgame, and Isabella intended to play it better than anyone expected. House Ravencrest wanted their crown back, but they would have to pay a price they hadn't anticipated. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon as she mounted her horse and rode toward Ravenshollow Castle. Behind her, an army moved silently through the forest. Ahead of her, 50 years of planning and hatred waited to be unleashed. But Isabella rode forward with the confidence of someone who had finally understood the true nature of power, not the ability to command from a throne, but the willingness to fight personally for everything you held dear. The confrontation that would determine the fate of Valdoria was about to begin, and the kingdom would never be the same. The ruins of Ravenshollow Castle stood silhouetted against the darkening sky like broken teeth in a giant skull. Once the proud seat of House Ravencrest, the castle had been partially destroyed during the Civil War and left to decay as a monument to the cost of rebellion. Ivy covered the fallen stones, and wild roses, black roses, had grown through the cracks in the walls like nature's cruel joke. Isabella crouched in the ancient watchtower, her longbow across her knees, watching the proceedings below through gaps in the crumbling stone. The tower had taken her 20 minutes to climb, using handholds that hadn't been designed for anything more demanding than servants carrying messages between floors. But it provided a perfect vantage point of the main courtyard where the confrontation would take place. In the gathering dusk, she could see figures moving among the ruins. Cassandra Ravencrest had arrived with a small entourage, just as promised. From her elevated position, Isabella could make out a woman with dark hair and elegant bearing, even in traveling clothes. This was the granddaughter who had inherited 50 years of planning and hatred. More importantly, Isabella could see Edmund. Her husband was seated on a broken stone that had once been part of an ornate fountain. His hands appeared to be bound, but he was upright and alert. Even from a distance, she could see the defiant set of his shoulders, the way he held his head high despite his circumstances. He was alive, and he was fighting. A sound from below made Isabella press herself against the wall. Her double, a palace guard named Sarah who bore a remarkable resemblance to the queen, was approaching the ruins on horseback, exactly as planned. Sarah had volunteered for this dangerous deception, knowing that discovery could mean death. "Your Majesty," came a voice from the courtyard below. Cassandra Ravencrest had a cultured accent, the result of education in foreign courts during her family's exile. "How good of you to accept my invitation." Sarah dismounted and walked forward with the regal bearing Isabella had coached her to display. "I've come for my husband. Release him, and we can discuss your grievances." Cassandra laughed, a sound like silver bells with an undertone of poison. "My grievances? How diplomatic." As if 50 years of exile were merely a misunderstanding to be smoothed over with pretty words. Isabella watched carefully as the two women faced each other across the broken courtyard. Cassandra was younger than she had expected, perhaps 28 or 30, with the kind of beauty that was enhanced rather than diminished by intelligence. She carried herself with absolute confidence, as if she were already queen. "You know why I've brought you here," Cassandra continued. "The crown that sits on your head belongs to my family. My grandfather was the rightful heir when his brother died. Young Edmund stole what should have been ours." "Edmund was the legitimate heir," Sarah replied, staying carefully in character. "Your grandfather rebelled against the lawful succession. My grandfather fought for justice." Cassandra's composure cracked slightly, revealing the passion beneath her controlled exterior. "He was older, more experienced, better suited to rule. But tradition, and sentiment favored a boy barely old enough to understand what kingship meant. From her hidden position, Isabella could see additional figures emerging from the shadows around the ruins. Cassandra had brought more people than promised, at least a dozen armed men positioned throughout the courtyard and surrounding forest. They were prepared for treachery, just as Isabella was. But that was 50 years ago, Sarah said. Whatever injustices occurred then, surely they can be resolved without more bloodshed. Cassandra walked closer, and Isabella could see the family resemblance to old Victor Ravencrest in her strong jaw and piercing eyes. 50 years, Cassandra repeated. 50 years of exile, of poverty, of being treated as criminals for defending our rightful claim. Do you know what it's like to grow up hearing stories of a stolen birthright? To watch your grandfather die in foreign lands, still planning his return to the kingdom that cast him out. She gestured toward Edmund, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Your husband sits on a throne built on lies. His father's legitimacy was questioned even at the time of his coronation. Documents exist that prove his mother had already been married when she wed the king, making Edmund himself illegitimate. Isabella felt ice form in her stomach. Even if the documents were forged, such accusations could destabilize the monarchy for generations. People would always wonder, always question, always doubt. You're lying, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Am I? Cassandra produced a scroll from her coat. Royal records from the Church of St. Helena, showing a marriage ceremony between Edmund's mother and a minor noble 3 months before her wedding to the king. Never annulled, never dissolved. Hidden for 70 years, but preserved by those who believed the truth should eventually come to light. The implication was clear. If Edmund's mother had been married when she wed the king, then their marriage was invalid, making Edmund illegitimate and his claim to the throne false. By the laws of succession, the crown should have passed to Victor Ravencrest, the king's brother. Even if that were true, Sarah said carefully, it doesn't justify kidnapping and treason, doesn't it? Cassandra's voice turned cold. When legal challenges failed, when petitions were ignored, when our family was driven into exile for asking inconvenient questions, what recourse did we have except to take what was ours by force? She walked to where Edmund sat and placed a hand on his shoulder. Isabella tensed, her hand moving instinctively to her bow. But I'm not unreasonable, Cassandra continued. I propose a simple trade. You publicly acknowledge my legitimacy as the rightful heir, abdicate your position as regent, and ensure my peaceful transition to the throne. In exchange, your husband lives, and your children are allowed to retain their noble titles. And if I refuse? Cassandra's smile was sharp as a blade. Then, King Edmund dies here tonight. Your children have mysterious accidents over the coming months, and I take the throne anyway through force of arms. The choice is yours, but the outcome is inevitable. Isabella had heard enough. She rose silently from her position, nocking an arrow and drawing her bowstring. The shot was difficult, nearly 200 yards in failing light, but she had been practicing archery since childhood and had always been exceptionally skilled. Her arrow flew true, striking Cassandra in the shoulder and spinning her around with the force of impact. The woman's scream of pain and surprise echoed off the broken walls as she stumbled and fell. That was the signal Isabella's forces had been waiting for. Captain Reynolds and his soldiers emerged from the forest like phantoms, surrounding the ruins from multiple directions. Lady Fairfax's agents appeared among the broken stones, crossbows trained on Cassandra's supporters. Duke Thornfield's cavalry thundered into the courtyard, their horses' hooves striking sparks from ancient paving stones. The Ravencrest forces found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Several surrendered immediately, throwing down their weapons rather than face certain death. Others fought briefly before being overwhelmed by superior numbers and positioning. Isabella descended from the watchtower as quickly as she dared, reaching the courtyard just as Captain Reynolds was cutting Edmund's bonds. Her husband was weak, but unharmed, and the relief of seeing him alive and whole nearly buckled her knees. Isabella, Edmund said, confusion evident in his voice as he looked from her to Sarah, who was removing her disguise. How did you? Later, Isabella said, embracing him briefly before turning her attention to Cassandra. The would-be usurper was seated against a fallen pillar, holding her wounded shoulder while Lady Fairfax's agents bound her hands. Blood stained her elegant traveling dress, but her eyes still burned with undiminished hatred. This changes nothing, Cassandra said through gritted teeth. The documents still exist. The truth about Edmund's illegitimacy will eventually come to light. You may have won tonight, but you cannot win forever. Isabella knelt beside her enemy, speaking quietly so only Cassandra could hear. You're right about one thing, this doesn't end here. But you've made a crucial mistake in your planning. What mistake? Isabella's smile was cold as winter. You assumed I would fight like a queen who inherited her power through marriage. But you forced me to become something else entirely. She gestured toward the soldiers surrounding them, toward the evidence of meticulous planning and flawless execution. I spent 3 days investigating every aspect of your conspiracy. Lord Westmere confessed everything. Your supporters, your plans, your hidden resources. Lady Fairfax's agents are already arresting Ravencrest sympathizers throughout the kingdom. Your rebellion is over before it could begin. Cassandra's face went pale as the implications sank in. Furthermore, Isabella continued, those documents you mentioned, the ones supposedly proving Edmund's illegitimacy, Lady Fairfax examined the originals while you were busy planning tonight's theatrics. They're forgeries, skillfully done but dated with ink that wasn't invented until 20 years after the supposed wedding. Your grandfather was indeed clever, but not clever enough. The fight went out of Cassandra like air from a punctured sail. 50 years of planning, preparation, and hope collapsed in a moment of recognition that her family's greatest secret was built on a foundation of lies. The real tragedy, Isabella said, rising to her feet, is that your grandfather probably knew the documents were false. But after years of exile, after watching his brother's son claim the throne, he convinced himself that any justification was better than admitting he had simply lost a political struggle. She looked around at the ruins of Ravenshollow Castle, at the broken stones and wild roses that had grown through the cracks. Your family spent 50 years preparing for a war based on a lie. And tonight, that war ends. As dawn broke over the forest, the surviving members of the Ravencrest conspiracy found themselves in chains, loaded into carts for the journey back to the capital. Cassandra rode in dignified silence, her wounded shoulder bound but her spirit broken by the revelation that her entire life's purpose had been based on fabricated evidence. Edmund rode beside Isabella, still weak from his captivity but growing stronger with each mile they put between themselves and the ruins. They spoke little during the journey, but their hands remained clasped, and that connection said more than words could express. What will happen to them? Edmund asked as they approached the palace. Isabella considered the question carefully. Cassandra and her inner circle will face trial for treason and kidnapping. But the others, those who followed her believing they were fighting for justice, they deserve some measure of mercy. She looked back at the column of prisoners following them. Exile again, perhaps, or imprisonment with the possibility of eventual pardon. The kingdom needs healing, not more executions. As they passed through the palace gates, Isabella realized that everything had changed. She was no longer the diplomatic, deferential queen who had deferred to councils and followed protocols. Crisis had forged her into something new, a ruler who understood that true power came from the willingness to fight personally for what she believed in. The crown still sat on Edmund's head, but the woman riding beside him had claimed a different kind of authority. She had proven to herself and to the kingdom that she could outmaneuver enemies, protect her family, and preserve the realm when everything hung in the balance. Prince Alexander and Princess Elena ran to greet them in the courtyard, their relief evident in tears and embraces. The family was reunited, the kingdom was secure, and the threat of civil war had been eliminated. But in the weeks that followed, as trials proceeded and the kingdom began to heal from the crisis, Isabella found herself thinking often about the ruins of Ravenshollow Castle, about the dangers of nursing grievances across generations, about the terrible price of building a life around hatred and revenge. She instituted new policies to address legitimate concerns from noble houses that felt marginalized. She opened channels for grievances to be heard and resolved before they could fester into rebellion. She strengthened the intelligence networks that had saved the kingdom, but also created systems for transparency that would prevent future conspiracies. Most importantly, she ensured that the story of House Ravencrest would be taught accurately in schools throughout the kingdom, not as a tale of heroic rebellion or justified revenge, but as a cautionary story about the dangers of choosing hatred over healing, vengeance over forgiveness. The crown of Valdoria remained secure, but the woman who helped protect it had been transformed forever. Isabella had learned that being queen meant more than wearing a title. It meant being willing to fight for your people with every weapon at your disposal, including those you never knew you possessed. And in the royal chambers where Edmund had vanished that night, the chess game remained unfinished on its board, the pieces still locked in their eternal struggle between kings and queens, strategy and sacrifice, power and its price. The kingdom had survived its greatest test in 50 years, but Isabella knew that somewhere, always, the next challenge was already taking shape. The price of the crown was eternal vigilance, and she had finally learned to pay it in full. The disappearance of King Edmund had ended, but the reign of Queen Isabella, the true ruler she had become through fire and crisis, had just begun.